2023 might have been one of the best years for back-to-back big releases that we've seen in a long while. From the games at the beginning of the year like Hogwarts Legacy and Jedi Survivor to start off the year on a strong footing, Tears of the Kingdom bringing us more greatness throughout, and then we ended up finishing off the year with the likes of Spiderman 2, Starfield and Bauldersgate 3. This year has given us many amazing games, and at the beginning of this year I made a video where I said that gaming was dead. Dead in value to the player, not in popularity, and I do still believe in that statement. That doesn't mean that I can't see how we've had such a great year, and I wanted to talk about exactly that. So today we're going to sit down and discuss the year of 2023, the highs, the lows, and how the issues I raised in the previous videos are still prevalent within the AAA gaming space. So let's talk about those exact things. Grab a cup of tea, sit down, and join me of an audit of 2023. Over the last couple years, I've spoken about this exact topic, but in different ways. The first video I released was called Is Gaming Dead or Are We Entering a New Age? From a 19-year-old version of myself. In that moment, I didn't realise just how much this topic would resonate with people, and I'm incredibly thankful to anyone who supported that video, and it really helped bring this channel to where it is today. That video was the first time I was making a video about a topic within games specifically in a long-form context. And all of this came from a place of emotion more than anything else, with how I felt fed up with the landscape of gaming at the time and the games that I was playing, with the topic of nostalgia being brought up and the negative antics of the gaming industry within that video. Around 8 months later, I made a definitive sequel and fleshed out my thoughts on that exact topic, diving deep into 4 specific areas, those being greed, unfinished releases, extreme criticism, and a lack of change. All 4 are topics that I believe need to be changed for the betterment of gaming. But have I changed any of my thoughts over time? A little bit, but I'm not necessarily going to dive deep into that specifically today. For now, I wanted to focus on one particular thing, of how 2023 showed us that gaming can truly be amazing again with the set of releases. However, this video won't wash away the negatives, so today I wanted to talk about the great games that we saw last year, the mistakes that companies made, and how we still saw from big AAA studios the same 4 mistakes they seem to be incapable of shaking. Just before we dive in, if you do like video essay content about games and topics within games, then make sure to hit the subscribe button. Leave a like whilst you're down there, and also make sure to join the community of like-minded players and just general enjoyers of pretty much anything in general in the Discord down below. Lastly though, if you do want to support the channel any further, then make sure to check out the Patreon. You can gain early access to videos like this, one-to-one chats with me, and input on future videos, and join the exiled ones within the Discord. But now let's talk about how we had some amazing games this year. The first game that I truly dived deep on this year was Jedi Survivor, and I absolutely enjoyed my time with it. I'll talk about all of the flaws later on, however, right now I wanted to give this game some praise. If you want to see my critique on the video, it will be coming out in the next couple of months, so make sure to hit the subscribe button for when that releases in the next few months. Now, this game does do a good job in one particular thing, which is giving us a Star Wars experience that most of us wanted. This was the first project in a long while that truly felt like someone actually cared about the world of Star Wars and bringing it alive for the players to roam around in. We may not have had tons of known locations to go wander around, but we had enough of the decent ones that it made it enjoyable. It delivered perfectly on avoiding the biggest concerns which I had, which was around the idea of how they would handle power creep within the sequel, and I didn't want them to take the Force Unleashed approach. Which I did love both of those games, however power creep was incredibly real and was on full display within both games. Within this game, however, you still feel challenged while adding plenty of new mechanics for us to mess around with and enjoy. It did everything a sequel should do perfectly. The next game needs no introduction, as it was one of the most talked about games of the year, which is Bauldersgate 3. I'm starting my playthrough of this game, and it's definitely a very good game. It's technically an indie title, however, in my books, a game that has $100 million for its budget is either at least a AA or AAA. Yes, I know by literal definition it's not, however, imagine trying to compare this game in scope and budget of something like Minecraft, Stardew Valley, and Hollow Knight. The game with $100 million backing it is definitely not comparable to either of those. A game that has $100 million backing it is definitely not the same as the other games. Besides that, I do believe that this game was a great change of pace for the larger gaming audience. This was the first game in a long time to truly capture the broader audience in a way that was an RPG game that wasn't just your stereotypical open world approaches. giving us a refreshing look at a PC release that didn't have tons of issues on day one and actually released very polished. Being able to get lost in a game that has so many possibilities and choices is refreshing and something that a lot of RPG games need to take into account moving forward. Too many RPG games come out these days feeling like they have half-baked mechanics. Then we had the much loved and highly anticipated sequel to Breath of the Wild. This game was something that you saw many people booking a week off work to play. It added a ton to what the first game had, and as we all know, Breath of the Wild is considered one of the best open world games ever made, and considered to some one of the most innovative. We saw a better story, a better world to explore, a better side content, better puzzles, and is graphically beautiful. A comment that I saw a while ago that sums this up pretty well is that Tears of the Kingdom makes Breath of the Wild look like a tech demo. This is probably one of the best compliments that you could give a game's sequel. Now Nintendo, all you need to do is release a next generation console of the Switch that can actually utilize its power and, you know, the dock maybe to give us more power so that we can actually get even more technically impressive games instead of relying on the old Switch nowadays. Starfield is next, which has to be one of the most polarizing games of the year. I can already see the comments down below of how can you put this game in the good section. Just calm down for a moment. I'm just going to talk about what I liked about the game. I'm talking about the flaws later on. I will get to those as well. This game though was the first single player game to be released by Bethesda Game Studios since 2015. We got 76 between each of those releases. However, in terms of the normal BGS title and what's in their wheelhouse of single player open world content, this was the first game in a while. Within this game, it brought us Fallout in space. This game is pretty much a refined version of Fallout 4. but with a cool ship customization, a nice leveling system, and plenty of places for you to explore due to procedural generation. This game is visually stunning and brings us an overall enjoyable experience. It might not be the most innovative game, but we will see what comes with the next Bethesda title, which hopefully will have some form of change up when we get to Elder Scrolls 6. And overall, this game, for anyone who loves the Bethesda style approach of games, will generally speaking, love its approach. This year was absolutely jam-packed with games that people wanted to learn more about, and one of those was Spiderman 2. This game was something that people have been waiting for since the first game ever released. We got to see another game with the iconic superhero, and overall, this game was received relatively well. I would dive deep onto this game, however, so far I've only recently picked it up, so I haven't gotten around to going through a full playthrough just yet. However, from everything that I've seen, the biggest criticisms around the game have to do with the game being short, and some of its mechanics not necessarily being overly special, and as if they kind of took it very close to their chest in wanting to ensure that they didn't mess up anything. However, again, like Jedi Survivor, from what I've heard, this game is a great sequel, does everything and added to the experience of the first game, whilst not compromising on what did work in the first game. And obviously, it improved on everything, and it also gave us both Miles Morales and Peter Parker within one game. The next game that came out of nowhere for me, and I'll be honest, I completely forgot about Alan Wake. These two games are going to be a duo that I'm definitely picking up this year to go through in the future. This is a game that a member of my Discord describes as the following. Alan Wake 2 was the biggest surprise of the year for me. I didn't expect anything from this game, and it gave me everything. Impressive graphics to a memorable story and very decent gameplay. The amount of passion placed into this game is at a different level, a level where you can actually feel it while playing. Sam Lake, in brackets, the writer, actor, voice actor, director, and producer of the game, closed brackets, and the team at Remedy that did a legendary job bringing this masterpiece. From now on, I am pre-ordering every Remedy game. End quote. Now that is definitely one hell of an endorsement if I've ever seen one, so as I said, this game and the original will both be on my either Steam list if the second game does end up on Steam. I can't see it right now, but if it does, then it will definitely be added on there as well. For me, the most mediocre game of the year has to be Assassin's Creed Mirage, the game I made my first critique on in almost 2 years. When I was playing this game, it felt like stealth was a requirement and not a feature, We got so used to that in many of the different old games, but in this game, not only do we get gadgets that are fun to use, but we genuinely end up feeling like a powerful assassin. The other area that was definitely one of the biggest redeeming factors of this game was its parkour. As I laid out within my critique, watch it if you want my full thoughts and explanations, but this game's parkour proved that it wasn't necessarily about the mechanics themselves, and more about the setting of the game that makes the parkour experience wonderful. Sea of Stars was also a game that was a pleasant surprise for me so far. For all those people in my previous videos telling me to go play indie games, just that you know I am. Here you go, I am telling you that I'm playing an indie game, and I've tried out some others as well. For now, I'm not talking about them. I'll be making future videos around them, but this game is one that's given me more love towards an art form and turn-based style of combat that I've been getting back into recently. From the early days of playing Pokemon through to games like Civilization 6, these games are ones that I love, and Sea of Stars is hitting that exact same itch for me, but with a lovely twist that feels like an old school title. The way this game looks is single-handedly one of my favourite parts of this game, because it feels way more like I'm playing a game from when I was younger. The next game was controversial for a time, but was an adventure many wanted to go on. The world of Hogwarts Legacy allowed Harry Potter fans to go and have the time of their lives within a world they grew up watching. It delivered on the primary promise of being a game focused on the experience for the lovers of the franchise. The combat isn't anything special, however this game makes up for it in its ways of exploration and the ability to feel immersed into the world of Hogwarts. Outside of the world of wizards, we ended up seeing big strides towards the future within the likes of Cyberpunk and its DLC of Phantom Liberty. Within the lead up to the DLC, we saw Cyberpunk getting plenty of patches to almost make it complete. It's something that I'll bring up later on, however the main reason I'm mentioning Phantom Liberty is that this is yet again another DLC from CDPR that proves DLCs can be done right and not feel like a complete rip-off. Many games need to focus on the main section of what makes Phantom Liberty successful, and it's its game's ability to add a ton of DLC instead of just adding a couple extra skins and a couple of locations within one thing. With Phantom Liberty, you end up seeing a ton of new storylines and a runtime of roughly, I believe, 25 hours if you wanted to complete all of it. And lastly, one of the more surprising games of the year was Lies of P, and it felt like it came out of nowhere. To be given a dark take on Pinocchio and a Souls-like experience for the matter being mixed in there. It's kind of like a good way of the, how there was the, dark themed horror movie of Winnie the Pooh. This is kind of like that, but in games, so they actually did a good job this time. As it's a Souls-like, this game is very similar in combat styles, but easy to understand and master than most Souls games. The level design is also something that we rarely see outside of the likes of Souls games, so again, it's a bonus to add on to this year, which was much welcomed. This gives us a minimum of 11 good games this year. However, you might find yourself thinking, how can one year have this many games that are at least decent within the AAA space? Most years find themselves walking around with maybe about 5 games each year, and we haven't seen a year like this since something like 2011. 2011 gave us Portal 2, Skyrim, Uncharted 3, Arkham City, LA Noire, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Battlefield 3, Dark Souls, Terraria, Dead Island, and one of the biggest games of all time with Minecraft. That was an insane year for games that we've never actually come close to in sheer quantity. However, there is a reason for this. 2 big factors that made 2023 possible, with one of them being the most obvious, which is that games take far longer to make now. Some don't like this excuse for games not being released, however, games are becoming harder and harder to make due to the sheer scope of each release. With the likes of GTA 6 looking to release 12 years after 5, Starfield having been in development for 7 years, and the best case scenario for the likes of Elder Scrolls 6 is 15 years after Skyrim, and that's best case scenario. From that list, we saw a load of games that were in development from as early as 2010, with the average being around 5 to 6 years, which is insane. So the mixture of games having a massive development window and the second big factor, which is delays, which meant that we had a stacked up year. If Tears of the Kingdom was released on time, we would have seen it released in 2022. If Starfield was released on time, again it would have been 2022. And one of the biggest games of the year was Bauldersgate 3, which didn't have a guaranteed release date. After plenty of speculation, the main idea was around 2021 to 2022. Obviously that's speculation and not a guarantee from the actual company themselves, however that was the rough idea. This meant that we saw a massively stacked year, and it was all because games take far longer to make now. And now that we've had this year, it does mean that we'll see these devs start to move on slowly and begin the development cycle in the next couple of years. This means that we won't be seeing another year like 2023 probably for at least 5 to 7 years, and that's being lucky. One of the most common comments on my video about gaming is dying, this is why, was around the idea that 2023 proves this entirely wrong by the smash hit of releases. However, in my opinion, that comes from people who simply put didn't listen to the ideas of what I was talking about. As my first sentence says in that video, gaming is dying, not in sales or in popularity, but in value. The value that was let down that I mentioned within that video was rocky releases, lack of change, overly critical players on the releases of games that weren't actually that bad, and most importantly, greedy antics of the modern gaming world. So it's now time for us to discuss and reinforce some of those points that I made in 2023. Yes, we have had a great year with many amazing games, but now I must mention some of the flaws of the year, and then jump into those 4 main boxes briefly. Our first game in this section is going to be Jedi Survivor, which I absolutely loved on launch. However, I would be lying if I said that the launch was completely smooth. I didn't personally experience a ton of issues. I'm still going to mention them as obviously they are important and they weren't just on PC. The first and most prominent was FPS drops on both console and PC. I played on the Series X and the load screens for this game to this day still has frame drops somehow. For me, the worst that I had was that I needed to complete one section before the final Dagon fight, and I would get such a bad frame drop that I would end up unable to defend myself. Due to this, I found a way to cheese that spot and get around it. Obviously, I shouldn't be having to do that to get through this part of the mission. The PC issues though were some of the biggest when it came to game launches on PC. This is all something that we shouldn't be having in games, especially a game that a month after launch had an update that fixed almost everything. So why on earth was it released when it was, when they could have just waited 1 month? This game also would get stuck on optimizing game files quite frequently, and casually had screen tearing issues, which again shouldn't be the case. The biggest one that I actually experienced was on my second playthrough. On the first one I didn't do any of the bounty hunter side quests. However, when I was finishing it up on the second one, I ended up getting to the final one before you do the final fight. For anyone who hasn't or doesn't know how the bounty hunter stuff works, I'm not going to spoil it here. Let's just say that I got stuck in a room and it literally wasn't like I couldn't exit the room at all. There was no exits at all. So after 4 attempts of doing the same fight over and over again, I just got stuck in the room, and sadly that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, and it meant that I just stopped playing the game from then on out. Diablo 4 was also one of the biggest letdowns for many Diablo players, from one of the biggest issues being around balances of classes, with some being way too overpowered and others being completely underpowered. It reminded me of something like gun balancing issues within Call of Duty Ghosts when that game came out. But the biggest issue that that game experienced was the lack of extra content after you got through the majority of its content. It had the Destiny issue. The game was released without any proper endgame content, which in my books isn't a complete game, when the game is meant to have endgame content, especially when the prior releases did. The game that did start the year off on an absolute strong start, which if you didn't know, this is just complete sarcasm, is Forspoken. Probably one of the worst releases we've seen in a long time. From the quality of the story to the gameplay and the fact that it came out as an Xbox exclusive tells you all you need to know about this game. This seems to be a common issue for Xbox. Over the last 5 years, they seem only capable of releasing half-baked releases that aren't racing games. This game was completely ripped to shreds by the internet due to its terrible voice acting and script writing, down to the boring and dull open world experience. A game that realistically shouldn't have been shown until it was actually in a good state, So please, stop releasing games that simply just scrape by on being a game, when that isn't what games are meant to be. They're also meant to be something a bit more than just a playable thing. They're meant to be enjoyable. That as well. That's an actual good benefit of playing many games out there. There is one game that completely outshone that, was Gollum, which was another beast in its own right. Let alone the fact that this game could hardly run for many players, and the overall look of the game was awful. It also had far worse issues being accused towards the company that made it. And as read from an IGN report, quote, Gollum developer Daedalic Entertainment has made a number of disturbing allegations about the company, including reportedly enforcing uncompensated overtime, allegedly trying to pay staff below minimum wage, and a toxic work environment cultivated by an alleged abusive leadership. Unquote. That is all some awful allegations to have thrown towards your game and the company itself, especially within the space of gaming, which has definitely taken the cake for the most awful release and probably some of the worst business practices of the year. At least do a CD Projekt Red. If you're going to crunch your staff members down to get a game out, at least release something like The Witcher 3. Come on now. Starfield though is the next game that I want to preface this with. I enjoyed the game and I actually, generally speaking, found it to be a good time. I haven't completed it and I still have plenty to do. However, for my experience that I've played, I have enjoyed it. But I do know that it lacks in a few different areas, mainly about how the game just doesn't feel up to date. This is due to the choice on Bethesda Game Studios' end to stay with the creation engine, especially for as long as they have. I don't hate this, but because I enjoy the general gameplay around those games and the stories being told. However, for many new players, or even players who have just gotten used to other games out there, I completely understand how this game does feel old, and for some, how it definitely doesn't feel innovated on. And the factor that the traversal, simply put, isn't that amazing. This is probably, in my opinion, the biggest issue for the game. I don't necessarily care about having load screens from the planet to space, however it does leave a bad taste in my mouth when I am doing a quest and I end up having to go through about 15 load screens to start the quest all the way through to finishing it. This here is one of the biggest letdowns for me that can either be put down to laziness or incompetence in changing from the creation engine. Bethesda yet again has added another game to the Xbox curse, which is Redfall. This game wasn't a BGS title, it was Arcane, which was definitely sad to see as I loved the Dishonored games. It ended up releasing with tons of performance issues, terrible multiplayer, awful gunplay, and the most well-known issue, which was how dumb the AI was, making the game not only not playable, but also in those moments where you could play it, simply too easy to be fun. Now those are just some of the issues as a game-by-game basis, so let's talk about the biggest deal of 2023. And I'm not on about deal as in what was the actual biggest deal of 2023, I'm on about the biggest financial deal, which was ongoing since the beginning of 2022 with the Activision Blizzard acquisition by Microsoft. On January 18th, 2022, Microsoft announced that they were going to be acquiring Activision Blizzard. This was meant to go through that year, however, as the year went on, it seemed less and less likely that it was going to be finalized. During 2022, the deal didn't finish, and therefore went into 2023. This deal is something to mention about the year, as it was finally pushed through almost every single regulatory hurdle. However, what was most interesting is what we learned about the console wars through the lens of Xbox, and in their eyes, what the future of gaming holds. We need to talk about the main aspect of this acquisition, which is simply put, pay to win. Xbox have been struggling for a while now, and during that time we've seen many boring games come out on the Xbox side of the gaming world. However, they seem to be taking the same approach as the last few years, and instead of focusing on making good games, they're throwing money at development and buying out companies in the attempt that they can still compete. What we learned through the purchase was that Xbox knows that they have lost the console wars, coming in third place behind both Sony and Nintendo. Xbox knows that they don't stand a chance when it comes to console sales, so they are taking a completely different strategy. This appears to be a three-pronged approach that could have a massive negative and/or positive consequence for the future of gaming. Those three focus on the idea of Game Pass, with games being sold on a subscription-based service. The next is focusing on bringing cloud gaming to the forefront. They fundamentally need cloud gaming to become the main focus of gaming for the future to establish complete dominance over the market. This is effectively what they are hedging their bets on. The reason why I say dominance is due to the first prong, which is that customers end up becoming a massive monthly earner for Xbox, but the actual last prong is probably the most important in this scenario anyway. Xbox knows that they are not able to beat Sony when it comes to a perfect track record with exclusives, but what they can do is bring more games to Game Pass and make Game Pass look like a better deal. I do personally lean more on the side of this deal being good, mainly because Sony has done the exact same practices and if anything has been worse for the average consumer over the last 2 generations of consoles. But I can definitely understand how this rubs people up the wrong way, mainly under the idea of monopolizing within the gaming landscape. My take is that they will hold a massive stranglehold over a few different parts of gaming. However, most of those areas only became like they are due to other companies' neglect. One of the takes that I'm willing to stand by is that the reason why we have Call of Duty the way it is today is completely because there is nothing to compete against it in the market, especially on console. When Battlefield casually released 2 bad games in a row, this meant that people had no more faith in this company to perform. And obviously, to add on to this, I understand that Battlefield games come out on EA Access, and EA Access is part of Game Pass. However, we don't know how that deal will go in the future, if EA will be taken by Microsoft. If they acquire EA, for example, a strong argument can be made for them attempting to create a monopoly over the FPS genre. This has led to the game franchise of Call of Duty pretty much being easily able to release games that have done the job well enough. Every year, the COD release cycle is hype for the first couple of months, then hating on the game massively, and maybe revisiting old games during that period of time, for by the time that the next game rolls around, people look back on the prior game or the couple of years prior game as relatively decent games. So something to think about in particular is going to be how Xbox handles this buyout of new developers, cloud gaming and Game Pass. Let me know what your thoughts are and whether or not you believe that cloud gaming will actually become as strong as Xbox are hedging their bets towards. Let's briefly go over those 4 main issues that I mentioned within my prior video and talk about how those issues have popped up within the last year. And the one that I'm going to be starting with is greed. I intend to make a proper video soon about $70 games. However, to make my point without taking up more of your time is that games becoming $70 doesn't make any logical sense outside of tiny arguments about inflation. Even with inflation being taken into account, games that are being released that are AAA in price would massively out-earn the entire cost that it takes to make and promote the game. For example, Red Dead Redemption 2 came out in 2018 at $60. This is a game that cost Rockstar reportedly up to $540 million to make, and within the opening weekend, the game completely smashed that, with Rockstar earning nearly $250,000 extra, which is rather insane to think about if you ask me. The reason I mention this is that gaming used to be a hobby that for the most part people could enjoy 10 years ago without feeling like they're being financially destroyed. For example, this year we saw many games released at $70, to the point that if you wanted to pick up, let's say, 5 of those games this year, it's going to cost you £350 minimum, especially if you want to play those games on launch. If that was 10 years ago, you'd be looking at least being able to buy 1 extra game for that price. This might not sound like a lot, but when you stack it up over the course of 10 years, that gives you 10 extra games to play. But when we live in a world where we hear whispers of Rockstar wanting to charge by the hour to play their game, this is something that we actually are becoming more and more accustomed to as they end up pushing us further and further up the price ladder, and making this hobby into a rather expensive one. Not necessarily the most expensive, but it's definitely getting there when you sprinkle in some microtransactions. The only people who will end up really being able to enjoy playing games is people who end up playing games that are 5 years old, or only stick to a set select of games and never go out of them. At least if you don't want to be financially bankrupt and ruined by it anyway. And for the people out there who will say, simply put, just wait for the game to go on a deal, I do agree with you, I do that pretty much all the time for myself. There are some games that I will get on launch, however, for the most part that is definitely the right answer. But there is a reason that is a strong argument to be made to why people like to buy games on release, which is simply you feel a part of a community that are enjoying the hype and the experience of being a part of this community at that given moment. There is something special about being a part of a gaming experience like it when it's happening. The other big area within this discussion around $70 price tags is that we still see them with a ton of microtransactions. I've mentioned in another video that I'm not inherently anti-microtransactions, especially when games are free to play, for example. When a game comes out with a hefty price tag on it, and they still are trying to find ways to, advertise skins, bundles, and battle passes at rates that seem low, but they're simply put ways to add to a barrier to entry that just, get you in the door. All of it is basic financial manipulation that companies use, and specifically mobile companies use, and casinos, with this idea that they can try and bait you in with the low price of, let's say, $5 to $10, as they know they've now broken your mental barrier and that you're likely to spend more money with them. The other issue is at least games like Fortnite have cool looking skins, and I can't say the same for the likes of Call of Duty. Next up, we're going to talk about a lack of change. The first basic ones are FIFA, or as it's known now as FC 24, or Call of Duty. They always seem like the same old copy and paste. Call of Duty at least messes around with the gunplay mechanics a fair bit, at least in the last set of releases. However, they are still almost identical to previous games. The game that I wanted to focus on is going to be Starfield, which is going to be more focused on the idea around this game feeling old and outdated, from the engine choice with the creation engine through to the overall feeling of gameplay. As much as I have enjoyed my time within the game, it does still feel a bit outdated, mainly due to the game feeling like a smoother Fallout 4, which can be a good thing and was a good thing a while ago. However, it does still mean that for many out there, it is a bit of a letdown. This is due to two primary factors. One being that the games that have come out over recent years completely smash it when it comes to how these games look and feel. But also, the modding community has made Skyrim into something completely different and a next level title if you mod the hell out of it. But Bethesda themselves seem to only want to be adding the bare minimum towards their gameplay. The game's main flaw comes in its inability of Bethesda to update their creation engine in a meaningful way or just change the engine at all. I understand why they don't, due to the full understanding of how to make a game within the engine itself, and they're the masters of that engine and it's theirs. But now we're getting to a point where we're seeing the restrictions from the engine and the gameplay doesn't feel like the same brand new thing that it might have done back in the day. For this game, the engine is the main fault and main perpetrator for many people out there, and one of the other big ones is also the load screens. People blame the creation engine due to the age of it. This is a point that's really easy to hit, especially if you're building into the hatred that a lot of people have started to have over Bethesda for the last 10 years. Technical limitations are the reason people believe that there is load screen issues, and Bethesda doesn't admit that to be the case. Bethesda claim that it's due to it not actually adding to the player experience. Outside of the lack of change with wanting to push past the creation engine, we saw the game having many of the same feeling and looks as the previous game. This is the reason why I genuinely believe the best descriptor for this game is Fallout in space. This game is extremely similar, but a very polished feel of Fallout 4. From the gunplay, leveling system, and movement system, through to how the game feels when you're in different outposts and factions. Many parts of Starfield feel extremely similar to the older games, which doesn't mean that you won't enjoy your time playing the game, but it is noticeable enough that it will enrage some players who believe that every game that releases needs to be the next best thing. So with that, I wanted to talk about extreme criticism, which is one of the main points that I made in my prior video. Again, I'm going to be focusing on Starfield, as I do believe that it has been overly criticised by many within the gaming space, especially before the game even released. This is something that I've spoken about in my Starfield rampant negativity video. That covers my whole opinion on this topic, and why I do believe for many people out there, this game ended up being set up to fail, especially for people who just didn't like Bethesda walking into it. My main point was that people even even before the release, was hoping for it to fail. We had people nitpicking over every small bit of information being given, with one of the most well-known examples of this was when people started saying how awful the game would be because the home screen wasn't an epic masterpiece. You'll see creators that I won't name who at any given opportunity will absolutely slate BGS, simply because if they don't, the community that they've embedded themselves within will turn on them. It's simply, in my opinion, grifting, as they aren't willing to actually show any form of praise, and at every given opportunity, they will show any form of hate. I don't believe this is what the gaming space should be. I believe we should be able to show what we love and we don't like about games. However, there is plenty of people who disguise themselves as gaming lovers out there, when in reality, they're just there to upload content and completely rip apart games and only praise games that are being viewed as perfect by the wider community. So for example, completely loving Witcher 3 without any question, and RDR2 without any question, God of War without any question, and not even saying if there is anything truly wrong with them. One of the reasons why I like someone like SkillUp, for example, is that he openly talks about how he doesn't like The Last of Us, which is something that you rarely hear in this community. And then if you listen to his takes when it comes to his overall thoughts on many different games, what he believes is overrated and underrated, you can actually tell that he has his own opinion, and he's not just occupying the same take as his audience. And the reason why I'm mentioning creators specifically is that I do believe that they had a big hand in how Starfield's lead up to launch was viewed, especially when you look at videos, TikTok after TikTok and comment section after comment section of people trying to tell others about how they shouldn't be hyped for the game because it's going to be awful, and telling people how simply the game doesn't look like it's going to be anything valuable. I even saw at times TikToks where you're literally looking at the comment section and people are genuinely trying to tell people that the game will be awful, and therefore you shouldn't even consider it, and the game at this point had nothing leaked about it. If you want to watch my full video about it, watch my rampant negativity video. I don't necessarily think Starfield is a perfect game. I do believe, however, that it was unjustifiably hated on to the extent that it was. So again, I do believe the game is valid of plenty of criticism, but I do think a lot of people just started nitpicking just to add on to a dog pile. The biggest issue that people have with games isn't if the game has greedy tactics, or if people are being overly critical, or again, that there is a lack of change over the years, as you can typically get away with this to a decent extent if the game functions well, and this year we saw two games that definitely weren't that on launch. With many games being released this year that still had technical issues on launch, but there is two games in particular I want to focus on. The first being Jedi Survivor. Jedi Survivor, as I mentioned earlier, had a plethora of bugs on launch. It wasn't just bugs, it was also experience-ruining gameplay problems. We saw a game that would end up being one of the best Star Wars titles that we've ever seen, but it also had some of the worst performance issues we've seen in a while. FPS drops to the point of unplayability at times, through the game's ability to give us load screens that took several minutes to load. These issues aren't something we should be seeing when a game gets released, and are certainly meant to be something that is found and fixed prior to launch when a game is playtested. For me, this impacted me on several different occasions, but for the most part I enjoyed my experience. As I mentioned, I had to cheese a part of the game so I could simply get past it, but this is not acceptable for a released title. EA should have waited to release this game, especially when you consider 1 month later they updated the game that fixed a massive load of these issues. All EA did in this moment was show that the goodwill from the first release was going to be used to allow them to cash in slightly earlier than they should have. There are rumours as to why this game was released at the time that it was, one being the Star Wars content cycle, but another one is that if they had waited 1 more month, they would have been up against Tears of the Kingdom, which would have had them in a losing battle for anyone who liked Breath of the Wild. The other game was Redfall, and how this game released is beyond me. At least with Jedi Survivor, the game was at like 98% complete, but when Redfall released, it was more at like 80%. This seems to be an odd track record that ZeniMax is choosing to allow, and Microsoft generally. Why would you let a game like this come out, especially after Fallout 76? That game was ripped to shreds for very similar issues. Why would you let another multiplayer game get launched with awful server functions, terribly dumbed down gameplay, and on top of that, an overall incomplete game. Why on earth this game got released, as I said, is just completely beyond me, and I have zero clue of whose person's insanity it was to release this. At the end of the day, 2023 was an outstanding year for games. I'm not going to take away from the amazing year that we just had for video games by making a video that's saying something along the lines of this year was awful, as that would simply not be the case and a flat out lie. Last year gave me plenty of hope towards the future of different games out there, but I didn't want to just say that there was no issues at all. So if you are going to take anything away from this, please make sure that it is that this year was amazing, but it was an outlier year. If we can see more of this sort of quality in game releases in the future, then we know that we're actually moving forward towards a world of gaming that is actually amazing. But we still need to stay vigilant when it comes to companies taking money out of our pockets for releases that are nowhere near complete. So in the future, just take caution and play games that you enjoy, stop taking in tons of opinions from the online world, and just make up your own before hearing anyone else's. With that all being said, hopefully you did enjoy this video. It's going to be the first one of 2024, and I've got plenty planned. I can't wait to show you the future of videos for this channel. I think it'll be interesting to hear what people think of many of them. If you want to learn more about what I've got planned for the first few months of the year, then make sure to check out the Patreon. For just $1 a month, you can just support the channel. If you want to get the Exiled Ones tier, that also helps out greatly. You get access to plenty of other benefits that I mentioned earlier in the video. And also make sure to come join the Discord. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.